Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I am finally going to be reviewing Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. I finally read it. Yeah! I know it took me literally forever to finally pick this book up, but I was so worried that I wasn't going to like it that I was like scared to read it despite all of the positive reviews. So if you've never been on my channel before, hi, welcome, I'm Violet. Stephen Graham Jones is one of those authors that I'm like convinced at this point I hate read. I know people love him, I know they do, but his kind of like gonzo style of prose doesn't work for me. When I first heard about him, it was only a couple years ago. It was right before The Only Good Indians came out, which is probably his most well-known novel before this series. And I was really excited because I thought the premise was really cool. I thought the setting was really cool. I was so excited, and I loved the opening chapter. And it just went very downhill for me after that. It was very difficult to read. It was very difficult to follow. Stephen Graham Jones writes a lot about Native American culture because he is Native American. It's present in all of his novels. But for some reason, The Only Good Indians decided to really highlight basketball, which is a large part of Native American culture. But I was a mascot all through college. I had to go to every basketball game for the most part. I never want to hear about basketball again. I have been basketballed out of life. I mean, there was more basketball in The Only Good Indians than there is in Space Jam. But it was just one of those books that didn't work for me. And I kind of thought maybe, you know, I wasn't the right audience for this, or he's an author whose writing you have to get really, really used to. And I had ended up reading Night of the Mannequins because I got that from Nightworms. It was a short story. I did not love it. It was supposed to be dark humor. I didn't get it. Again, his prose is so heightened that you really, really, really have to focus. It's definitely a literary fiction style of prose and not just a leisurely prose. Even though it's like slashers, you know? And he loves slashers. That is his thing. You know, he got famous for a novel called Final Girls. I believe, or The Final Girl, something like that. I haven't read it yet. I've heard interesting things about it. And then I also read Mongrels, which is his werewolf book, and I didn't like that at all. In fact, that one was so hard for me to get through, and I felt like nothing happened in it. And the only reason I even read My Heart is a Chainsaw, which is now his probably best-known book. It is the beginning of this series. It is the Indian Lake trilogy. This is book 2. I was given an e-copy of My Heart is a Chainsaw through, I believe, NetGalley. So I had an ARC before anybody else, like 9 months before everybody else. And so I read it, because if you're going to send me the book, I'm probably going to read it, you know? And I devoured it. I think it was my second highest rated book for that year, so what was it, 2021? I loved it. I was blown away by the type of writing Stephen Graham Jones was able to capture in that story and how different it was from his other stuff. It still had moments of his kind of gonzo prose and moments of this heightened literary fiction, but it wasn't boring, it wasn't difficult, it was fun, and it was a love letter to slasher films, and I adored it. It was a perfect 5-star for me for the most part. So I was really scared to pick up Don't Fear the Reaper because if it didn't live up to My Heart is a Chainsaw, I was going to be crushed, and I knew it was going to be very hard for me to get through this book. What I've kind of discovered about My Heart is a Chainsaw and why I think it works for me and this whole series, because spoiler alert, I enjoyed this book and we're going to talk all about it, is I think that by framing the narrative through the lens of, I believe Jade is 17 in the first book, a 17-year-old horror fanatic and a girl, Stephen Graham Jones can't necessarily use his heightened literary tone, I guess is what I'll say, and then be writing from the perspective of a 17-year-old girl. He has to really bring it down a bit. I think Jade is a great character. I think she's very likable. I think she's very relatable. I think she is a very, very classic 2010s teenager. The first book does take place in 2016 or 2015. I think it actually might take place in 2015. But I loved it. I loved the little excerpts where she gave her extra credit reports on the history of horror. I thought it was very insightful. You could see that it was a love letter to the genre from Stephen Graham Jones. I liked how meta the book was. I liked how almost self-aware it was in the horror genre. I loved it. So picking this one up, again, hesitations, but I started reading it and I immediately kind of fell back into the world of Jade. I'm going to read the inside flap. There will be minor spoilers for the first book if you haven't read the first book, just so you know. So it says, 4 years after her tumultuous senior year, Jade Daniels is released from prison right before Christmas, when her conviction is overturned. But life beyond bars takes a dangerous turn as soon as she enters her hometown of Proof Rock, Idaho. Dark Mill South, seeking revenge for 38 Dakota men hanged in 1862, escapes from his prison transfer due to a blizzard just outside of Proof Rock. Dark Mill South's reunion tour began on December 12th, 2019, a Thursday. 36 hours and 20 bodies later, on Friday the 13th, it will all be over. Okay, so first off, the setting in this book, having it be the exact same setting as the first one, but setting it in winter instead of summer, I thought was brilliant. I really, really loved the snowy setting. I thought it added to the atmosphere. It elevated the stakes of this slasher night. I really, really enjoyed that. I loved how Stephen Graham Jones was really able to just show Proof Rock at its worst, even after the July 4th massacre that most of the town did survive, but a lot of people were lost to. You could kind of really see how the events of the first book are still heavily, heavily hanging over the town and, of course, Jade. One of the things, though, that did actually bother me very, very, very much is I felt like this book had less Jade in it for two reasons. First, for the first half of the book, she goes by Jennifer. She is no longer claiming to be her teenage self. This is set 4 years later. She's, I believe, 22 now. The math on that doesn't quite make sense, but whatever. And she's now 22, trying to kind of separate herself from the slasher obsession that landed her in her predicament in the end of My Heart is a Chainsaw. And I knew that once they even introduced this, like the first pages where we get Jade, I knew they were going to do the, it's not Jennifer anymore, it's Jade, right? Where she goes back to being herself. I knew that was going to happen. That is a horror cliche, that is a movie cliche, that is a cliche that you will see in any kind of like sequel or spin-off of a main character. It's been done a ton. And so I just kept gritting my teeth, like reading Jennifer Daniels, Jennifer Daniels, Jennifer Daniels, and just waiting for Jade to come back in. And once we got her, it was great, and I felt very much more at home, as I did with My Heart is a Chainsaw. But I really just wish that he had kind of truncated the Jennifer thing, because I knew where it was going, and I didn't need that much buildup. It's like literally half of the book of calling her Jennifer. Her name is Jade, and she wears crazy eyeliner that she applies very badly. And in this book, the eyeliner is 4 years old, which just makes me think she's going to get sty infection, but whatever. Anyway, once we got back to Jade, I was very, very happy with that. But the other thing that made it feel less Jade is we still get these extra credit history lessons, but they are not written by Jade. And that I was okay with at first, because it kind of seemed like the history lessons were going to be about serial killers. That's kind of how the first one is. And it ended up not. It ended up going back to slasher history. But it was nowhere near as fun and heartfelt as Jade's were. The other thing is you don't actually know who is writing these extra credit entries or for who for a very, very long time. You can kind of figure it out, and it kind of gets like revealed at the end, I guess. But it wasn't a reveal that I cared about, and I really would have just loved more from Jade. Like they could have been diary entries or an exercise that she was doing in like therapy because of her PTSD from the July 4th event. You know, like I felt like there was a different way to do it. I understand that what's happening is probably leading to the conclusion of this trilogy, so I'm interested to see if it makes sense in book 3, but kind of losing Jade's voice definitely bothered me a lot, because that is what I loved so, so much about the first one. This one I think is very, very interesting. Again, I really did think it was going to lean more into the serial killer vibe. It doesn't. It stays very, very much with the slasher vibe, though I do love that Stephen Graham Jones decided to really go all the way with the slasher knowledge and include more modern day slasher references. He had a lot of obscure ones from the 80s in My Heart is a Chainsaw, and really didn't touch on too many like well-known franchises. Like he obviously talks about Scream and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. They're obviously there, but he hyper focuses on some of the B categories, and I loved in this one seeing like Jordan Peele get referenced, and It Follows being referenced, and Ready or Not being referenced. Like, I really loved having all of these newer films really be spoken about. I thought it was great. And I loved how in this movie, or in this book, Jade is up against somebody who understands slashers. In the first book, she's not. She's up against somebody who is a slasher. But in this story, we're facing somebody who knows their stuff. And I liked that. You could get all of the different references of all the different movies, and they're very blatantly pointed out what references are being made, but there's certain nods here and there that I really, really, really enjoyed. I did love seeing Jade and Letha back together. I was a little stunned by Letha's storyline. I kind of wanted more, because Letha, I felt like, really became a side character in this story. Like, her and Jade have their moment. They've got like a solid couple chapters together, but she really was a backseat character. And kind of all of the characters around Jade were. Jade really has elevated herself to final girl status, where she is the primary focus and what I care most about. That being said, this book was so complicated. I do not know what happens at the end of this book. There are so many layers, there's so much folklore, there's so many characters being pulled in and out, and you don't get a conclusion. You don't get a conclusive answer as to who is doing what at the end. And it makes everything 100% worse, because two of our like new main characters, they were in the first book, but they're more heightened in this book. They're very, very pivotal. Are twins that just nobody can tell apart. And so I had to like really struggle with figuring out which twin was doing what, because even the characters in the book don't, and their actions are very, very, very pivotal to the plot and the reasoning and why everything is happening. One of them is this book's like predicted final girl. Like, Jade goes out on a limb and is like, this is what's happening. So it was extremely complicated. I need to read the third book to, I think, understand what I read in the second book, but it was still very, very enjoyable. I wish the answers were more laid out for me, but that is just a Stephen Graham Jones thing. I feel like, because I remember reading the ending of My Heart is a Chainsaw and being like, I have no idea what just happened in these last 10 pages, and then the beginning of this book, like, fully clarified everything. So I'm assuming that's what is going to happen in the next one. We will see, we will see. But the twin thing was very confusing. On top of that too, having our main narrator, like our essay writer, not really be the focus of the story, kind of being this like actual narrator, I thought was a choice. Again, like I said earlier, I don't think I agreed with it, but it was still fun, and I have a feeling it's going to play into the third book. There's a whole storyline too with like a white elk or an albino elk. I'm assuming that is some sort of Native American folklore reference, because to me, all I could think about was Princess Mononoke. But that was another storyline that I was just like, I have no idea what's going on here, and I'm not going to even touch that. It was very cool. It was very beautiful. It was also very gory, that like whole sequence and storyline. But one of the things that I will say that I think Stephen Graham Jones really amped up in this book that was not present in My Heart is a Chainsaw is his level of body horror and gore. This book was much more violent, much more descriptive, much more uncomfortable to read, especially because there were a lot of chapters through the victims' perspectives. Like, you really got to know the backstories of these teenagers who were getting taken out by this slasher, which I thought was really, really cool, especially because when you look at most slasher films, especially like the classics from like the 80s, we are usually rooting for the killer. You don't get a lot of backstory on the extras that are taken out early. This book really made sure that you did. And you almost really sympathize with some of them, even if they're not good people. Like, you remember, oh wait, these are people. These are, I mean, they're not actual people, but like, you're supposed to think that they're actual people. And Stephen Graham Jones really humanized them, which made their demises that much more tragic. And I do love how all of the slashings were nods to iconic horror film slashings. I loved that. Again, like I said, he really does point it out, but when you kind of know what's coming for these characters, being in their heads really does suck. It really is quite dismal and depressing. The whole town of Proof Rock is dismal and depressing, and a lot of the people who live there are dismal and depressed. So you get a lot of that. I loved that Stephen Graham Jones was like, screw it. There's a video store in this town now. Thought that was a really funny nod just to Jade's old nostalgia for owning horror VHS tapes. Loved how it was incorporated into the story. So I'm trying really hard not to give anything away because there are a lot of characters who were minor characters in book 1 who are now major characters in book 2. But again, as they become more major characters, Jade has again risen to the central focus of this trilogy, even though half the chapters weren't from her perspective. But I did very much enjoy this book. I did. It was a 4-star though. It was 4 stars. My Heart is a Chainsaw, solid 5 stars. I really have very few complaints about that book. I went in thinking I was going to hate it, and Stephen Graham Jones was like, no, I'm going to make you like me. He's trying real hard because this was a very, very good read. And it was a very solid sequel. Unlike a true trilogy like Lord of the Rings, the second book was not better than the first. This is not a Two Towers moment. But I liked it. I loved the title. And again, the writing for me, it was definitely one of these books where, like, I knew I couldn't, like, speed read this. Like, I really had to pay attention to every single sentence. But I wasn't feeling bogged down the way I am when I read other Stephen Graham Jones works. So I definitely really greatly appreciate that. And I really liked the afterword of this story. The afterword is really, really long for an afterword. It's like 5 pages. And it gives you such a good glimpse as to how all of Stephen Graham Jones' work previously have basically been precursors to writing this trilogy. He's been fleshing out these characters and his horror history to create this trilogy. This is probably going to be his magnum opus, and it's very, very good. And again, if you don't like Stephen Graham Jones's writing typically, you'll probably really like this series. If you love Stephen Graham Jones normally, you'll probably like this series, but just note that the language will be toned down significantly to something that is more of a story and less of like a introspective look, an introspective slice of life. I feel like that's kind of how Stephen Graham Jones writes a lot. But you can tell how much of a love letter this is to slasher film, and it's definitely continued. I will be reading the 3rd book. Hopefully I won't like take as long. I think it took me 2 years to like build up the courage to read this book, but I'm happy I did. Again, winter setting is great. The winter setting is absolutely phenomenal. I'm so happy I read this in winter when it's been like 17 degrees out, because the setting and the isolation and the way that they use snow, I thought was awesome. I really, really loved it. I loved, again, looking at Prufrock from a completely different lens, not only with the 4-year delay and the aftermath of 4th of July, but also looking at it in the reverse season. We are no longer in summer, we are now in winter, deep, deep winter. And I thought it was great. I will say there are a couple plot holes to me, and there are some characters who do some really, really stupid things. And if somebody could explain to me how buckshot works, because there's a character who gets hit with buckshot like a bajillion times and like walks away without a scratch, and that confused me so much. Please let me know. Please let me know. And we will see where this trilogy goes, because I have a lot of unanswered questions. I have a lot of unanswered questions, mainly revolving around Cinnamon, Ginger, and Armitage. Again, one of the things that I think is really commendable with Stephen Graham Jones is he really likes to tackle very, very, very difficult topics that could affect a teenage girl in life. In Jade, it was her very abusive relationship with her father. In this story, it is about a student who is having a questionable relationship with her teacher. Yeah, I really like how Stephen Graham Jones is alluding to what's happening solely through like the PTSD of the teenage girl before ever coming out and actually saying what's happening, so you can kind of see how it's forming, what the girl is doing and why she's acting the way she's acting. I think it's a really, really feminist way to tackle really, really difficult topics. I love how he handles it in both books. I think it's something that should be talked about as something that is truly horrifying versus, you know, made up slasher characters. Again, it goes back to my idea of like using horror as a coping mechanism when you have like anxiety or depression or things like that. You know, the controlled environment of being in like the horror film versus the horrors of reality. I love that he does that, and I love that that's a theme that is continued through here, affecting a different girl this time, and handled with a lot of poise that makes it not a shock factor, but something that is driving a character forward, and should be, you know, talked about and not hidden. How something that traumatic can affect somebody. I really, really appreciated that, and I thought that was a nice nod back to Jade's story in the first one. carried over into this one in a very, very tasteful manner. Anyways, that is all that I have to say. Read this book. Read this book. If you really liked the first one, read this book. It's worth it. If you don't like Stephen Graham Jones, give the series a try. I really love My Heart is a Chainsaw. It's a better title, too. Like, no offense. Don't Fear the Reaper, great title, but not... Like, My Heart is a Chainsaw, you read that book and you're like, I understand what that means. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I try to post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. And if you enjoyed these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah!